The latest national CBS poll shows Biden beating Trump by 10 points. That's a 6-point shift towards Biden in just 2 months. And according to CNN polling, the former vice president is set to win a majority in states where Trump beat Hillary back in 2016, including states like Texas, Arizona, and Michigan.
Americans' perception of Biden might spell trouble for Trump, with Joe Biden's approval rating at about -1 point, whereas back in 2016, Hillary Clinton's approval rating was -17 points, as reported by Real Clear Politics polling average. Friend of the show, journalist Matt Taibbi, joins us now to share how the coverage of 2016 compares to the coverage of this campaign. And Matt, it's always great to see you.
Good to see you, Matt.
Good to see you both, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So Peter Beinart had this big piece in the New York Times saying that basically Joe Biden is winning because he's a man, right? And Hillary Clinton suffered for sexism, and otherwise they were more or less equivalent. She could have been in as powerful a position if she had just not been a woman. And I wanted to get your take on it because you covered both campaigns, you covered both candidates. You also covered Elizabeth Warren in this campaign, someone Peter Beinart also cites as having been a victim of sexism. I just wanted to get your thoughts on your perception of whether the media coverage had been skewed in that direction, what you made of the piece.
I think it plays a role. I think sexism probably played a significant role with Hillary Clinton, but that was also mixed with other factors that made those instincts worse. The thing that I consistently heard from people on the trail about why they didn't like Hillary Clinton is because she symbolized for them a Washington insider, and she was also running on that experience at a time when there were a lot of people in the country who saw that as a negative. So, this time around, I think there's probably some validity to the hypothesis that Biden is doing better just because he's a man, but it probably also has something to do with the fact that he's just not in the public eye very much. People have a different perception of him, and look, he swept through the Democratic primary without performing terribly well at all, which speaks to something else that's going on with him, which is that people are just voting for him for reasons that are very vague and have, I think, character-based. And don't have a whole lot to do with a lot of specifics.
And well, this is something I think that you have touched on many times here, Matt, which is that a broader lack of ability to grapple with many of the other substantive reasons for why people would reject Hillary Clinton. I mean, ultimately, the keeping and the preservation and the pumping of the Russiagate story, I think, was central to that. And same, I think, sexism is really just used by others in order to paper over many of her own faults, which Biden just doesn't have, or if he does have, that the voters care about much less this time around in particular, right?
Yeah, I think when Hillary won, when Hillary lost, the immediate explanations were sexism in Russia, and I think there was something to the sexism thing. I certainly wouldn't say there wasn't, but lots of the other things that were clearly factors in the last race were skimmed over or ignored by a lot of the national press figures who were doing autopsies of that election. In particular, the kind of wholesale rejection of neoliberal economics and Clintonism, and the things that were driving both the Trump campaign and the Sanders Democratic primary campaign in 2016. All of that stuff was ignored in the wake of Trump's win in 2016. And they never really came to grips with what it was that was going on in the population that made people so angry with politicians. The trend really historically is that whatever politician casts himself or herself as the more outsidery candidate of the two, that candidate tends to win in elections almost every time, and that's a trend going back a long way. And that was certainly a huge factor with Hillary last time.
Yeah, here's the thing that also makes me uncomfortable with this conversation as someone who ran for office myself, certainly saw tons of blatant sexism. Certainly there was sexism both in the coverage of Hillary Clinton and also the way that voters received her. But because that particular narrative that she lost because of sexism became so pervasive, I think that did actually impact the women candidates on the Democratic side this time around, because you had an electorate that was so driven by just electability concerns, right? It was like, we got to do, I don't care who it is, if it's Michael Bloomberg or Joe Biden or whoever it is, we just got to have the person who can beat Donald Trump. And so if the narrative that you've internalized is that basically a woman can't win because Americans are too sexist to vote for a woman, I think that did actually hurt the chances of the women who ran this time around. And so it becomes this kind of vicious cycle where you have to be able to talk about the reality of sexism on the trail without also creating this self-perpetuating cycle where people are convinced that a woman can't win, and so they don't vote for a woman because they're afraid of the sexism of their fellow Americans that would prevent them from being able to defeat Donald Trump or whoever the Republican is.
Yeah, and I think that fits under the heading of something that's happened over and over and over again in American politics. It's not always sexism that's the issue, but it certainly was there, that we create a phony standard of electability in our press analyses of what happens in an election, and then people become afraid of that standard going forward, and they won't go near a certain kind of politician, whether that person is too left, too progressive, too radical. In this case, I think you're right. I think that calculation did affect a lot of people, and I think that was silly, really, because Hillary, won the popular vote and was this close to winning, and really, but for a couple of incidents towards the end of the campaign, probably would be president right now. So it shouldn't have dissuaded candidates from running, and it shouldn't have dissuaded voters from voting that way if that's the way they felt.
Mm-hmm. And, Matt, you're not out on the campaign trail this time, probably for the first time in a long time. Yet, what are your observations on that? What is the political press missing? What are their missteps that you think so far in this race?
It's really hard for me to say because I'm not out there as much, but I do think that that Biden's campaign strategy is to try to keep him as low profile as possible, and I think that's very smart. The campaign last time, the Democrats' strategy was really clearly to trumpet Trump's negatives as much as possible through their own media, right? In other words, they did commercials about it. They constantly hammered it through voices that they were friendly with in editorials. This time around, really, they're just sort of letting the Trump talk and dig his own grave. And I think that's probably smarter. Maybe that's by necessity. I don't know. But Biden has been scarcer, and that has helped him. It helped him during the primary season as well, for that matter.
And do you think that's a sustainable posture?
I don't know. It would be interesting to see if your candidate literally does not appear before the public but wins the presidency. We've seen dumber things. I mean, Trump was I think you could accurately say that he was at some point really trying to lose the last election, and he won anyway. So this time around, if we had a candidate whose campaign strategy was not the campaign and won anyway, that would fit in perfectly with the sort of overall stupidity of our presidential election cycle in the last couple of turns.
Well said, Matt.
Says a lot about us, doesn't it? All of
Absolutely.
us collectively as a nation.
Thank you,
Matt. Thank you. Great to see you.
All right. Thanks, Sagar. Take care.
Good to see you, man. Next on Rising, the DNC Democratic Platform Committee was busy yesterday, and we're going to tell you what that party is for, or mostly against, when Rising continues.